Because of who I am and what I do, I've been called these insults and more. I've been called a slut, a vagina on legs, a blow-up fuck doll. Some of these words have come from clients, from relatives, from people who have claimed to have my best interests at heart. But mostly they have come from feminists, or, to be specific, sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, otherwise known as SWERFs. My experience of this kind of abuse is minuscule compared to how sex workers are treated on a wider scale, today and historically. We are consistently spoken over and left out of feminist discussions. We are an easy example of the violence of men, the corruption of capitalism, the way women are brainwashed into serving the patriarchy. Many feminists are preoccupied with eradicating the sex industry at the expense of those in it. And by failing to recognize sex work for the physical and emotional labor it is, forget that, most importantly, sex workers are human like anyone else and deserve to have our living and working conditions fought for just the same as everyone else. Instead of fighting for us, they fight against us. They focus on demands and discussions that are completely reductive, such as whether or not I'm empowered by my job, something that workers in other industries are not repeatedly asked before their job can be viewed as legitimate. Empowerment is not a prerequisite for human rights. In fact, being given human rights is a step towards empowerment, not the other way around. In March last year, Swedish feminist Katja Ekis Ekman referred to Thai sex workers as cheap pussy. Empower Foundation, the Thai sex worker rights org, had this response. Perhaps you don't know that sex workers in Thailand are mothers and family providers. Tonight, at least 300,000 of us will go to work who have never heard of you. You do not need to agree with what we do to earn our living. However, your disapproval should not be allowed to incite hatred or stigma against us. This is just one example of many where sex work is devalued and sex workers are let down by and excluded from feminism. Regardless of your moral or theoretical problem with sex work, attempting to wipe it out does nothing to help those in the industry. What this does do, though, is make surviving even harder for those who are most marginalized. Sex workers are often working class, women of color, migrants, queer. Many are the mothers. Sometimes drug users too, who then face the double stigma of being both sex worker and drug user. Sex work is often the refuge of those shut out from the dream of financial security. It has been a way for migrant women, the working class, and women of color to reverse the status quo, as through it they can gain access to wealth and power by financially profiting off something they're not meant to financially profit from, and is meant to be controlled by a man. That is their sexual and emotional labor. Society is preoccupied with women who can transcend their birth in this way. Think of Holly Golightly from Breakfast at Tiffany's, Marilyn Monroe, Blac Chyna, Melania Trump, who posed for men's magazines in the 90s, which comes under the broader umbrella of sex work, as does all soft porn. The knee-jerk reaction that people often have to sex work, couched in a moral mumbling that it is wrong, is tied up with ideas of how women should behave. We are not meant to financially capitalize on our sexuality, but instead give it freely and within the bonds of a relationship. This is why men's sex workers are not scrutinized in nearly the same way as women's sex workers. There is no discounting of their autonomy or attempts to save them. When men's sex workers are clamped down on, it is generally homophobic. The bathhouse raids of the 80s, for example, were more concerned with the visibility of homosexual sex than whether or not men could consent to transactional sex. Women sex workers are seen as passive victims, slaves to the patriarchy, people whose decisions have to be made for. This is how high-profile white actresses such as Meryl Streep, Lena Dunham, Kate Winslet, Anne Hathaway and others can think it is appropriate in 2015 to sign a petition against Amnesty International's decision to advocate for the rights of sex workers. Blind criticism of sex work is ironic, especially coming from these actresses. As a few hundred years ago, actresses were viewed as sex workers because of the way in which they stepped outside the private sphere allowed for women into the public sphere, and often were sex workers too, such as in the case of Nell Gwyn, the renowned actress and mistress of Charles II. I ask, how come faking intimacy in front of a camera is fine, but not between two consenting adults? I ask, how come putting up with an exploitative director is fine in the name of art, but my decision to work under a brothel manager is not mine to make? How can these women look down from their immense tower of wealth and privilege and say how other women can or cannot make money to survive? Casting couch or brothel bed, what is the difference? Women use their body as an individual beauty privilege in many diverse ways to live in this world. And I say use because it is important to note that I do not sell my body. I do not par away at myself with each work interaction till I'm whittled away to nothing at all. I'm just as loving, caring, open and independent as I ever was. I'm just as much of a person as I ever was. And if I do rent out my vagina, how is that any different to a laborer renting out their arms to stack shelves? An athlete renting out their body for public entertainment? A model renting out theirs to sell products? In 1917, at a US protest of sex workers, brothel madam Reggie Gamble said, "Nearly every one of these women is a mother or has someone depending on her. They are driven into this life by economic conditions. You don't do any good by attacking us. Why don't you attack these conditions?" These words ring true 100 years later. If people are so concerned with how other people make money to survive, why don't we make surviving easier for those who are most marginalized? Why not the same passion when it comes to public health care being threatened, racial discrimination in workplaces, cuts to public school funding? Theoretical arguments can be conducted above our heads, but it is legislation and stigma that affects us. The Swedish model, which exists across a number of countries and criminalizes the buying of sex rather than the selling of sex, defines pimps as anyone who lives off the earnings of a sex worker. In execution, this means that sex workers can't work together for safety, can't screen clients, can't rent a property, can't use their earnings to send their children to university. The system in the UK this year saw a 70-year-old brothel cleaner charged with brothel keeping after she attempted to save the life of a man who collapsed there. The system in the US, which uses condoms as evidence of prostitution across a number of states, such as California and New York, condemns many street-based sex workers to working without condoms for fear of arrest and the assault that comes at the hands of the police. It also completely ignores the fact that for many sex workers, this is their only viable avenue of income. I'm incredibly lucky to work in a place where sex work is decriminalised. New South Wales is one of only 2 places in the world. New Zealand is the other. So my job is subject to the same rules and regulations as any other industry. Unlike sex workers in the Republic of Ireland, I do not have to worry about being raped by a policeman threatening to arrest me. Unlike sex workers in South Australia, I don't have to worry about being arrested and having a conviction on my record that makes it even harder to exit the industry. I can't donate blood, I can't get work cover, I can't travel to the US, and I very likely will come up against stigma when looking for a job or a rental property. But I'm incredibly lucky. I can work to support myself in safety. I can seek legal aid if something happens to me. And I can, as a white woman, speak about my job without it being used as an argument against my validity as a citizen of this society, or without being held up as an example of my race, both of which happen to migrant women and women of colour. Because of my education, people often assume that I came to sex work out of a desire to earn my own money, to be independent from my parents. When in reality I came to it because my single unemployed parent could not support me, even though he wanted to. In the dichotomy presented in the media of either glamorous, high-flying escort or drug-addicted, downtrodden victim, there is little place for the myriad of stories between. I have worked with an African immigrant who could not get another job because English wasn't her first language, but was able to save up enough through sex work to start her own business and be financially independent from any future partner. I have a friend whose mental illness does not allow her to commit to normal contracted work, but can come and go and work whenever she is able to with sex work's flexible hours. I have worked with a woman stashing away money after every shift so she could save up enough money to leave her abusive husband with her 2 children. Yet if she'd gone to the Salvation Army for help, very likely the first thing they would do is recommend that she leave sex work and put an end to her only income. These unending and moral arguments around sex work distract from the real issue. Instead of having to justify our humanity, justify our profession, and prove our humanity, we should be included in the mainstream feminist movement. So what can you do to incorporate sex workers into the general fight for human rights? Remember that you are the new generation, a political generation, and it is you that will hold sway and shape the future in the years to come. As client, sex worker, member of society, it is you who will affect how sex workers are treated by both legislation and those around them. Watch your language. Even a casual negative comment such as, "she's dressed like a whore," dehumanizes us. Watch your assumptions. Just because a woman is a migrant does not mean she's been trafficked. Include them in feminist discussions. Include them in discussions about PrEP, antiretroviral drugs used to prevent HIV infection, and national health initiatives. The slowing in the spread of HIV in the 1990s is directly and partly attributable to the decriminalisation of sex work in New South Wales in 1995. Donate to sex worker rights orgs. Stand up for sex workers when we're abused online. But mainly, remember that we are not deserving of rights because we are respectable. We are deserving of rights because we are human. Thank you.